To what we've been doing every year for over 10 years. We have some previous speakers here. What you are watching was done last year, and she's here. Omi Oshun, the presenter, she's sitting there in the corner. Yeah. Professor Barbara Harlow presented, and we have Ben Limfors, who also presented. This year, we lost one of the presenters, Professor Catherine Bone in the Department of Government, who is now at the London School of Economics. We've lost her, and she's terribly missed because she's always here every year. But we have new additions, and we have Sylvia please can you? So she's just joined us, a new faculty, and she is teaching classes on South Africa and gender. Welcome to Austin, and hopefully you will give one of these lectures in future. Our speaker for next year is Ted Gordon, who is the present chair of the AADS, and will be announcing his topic in due course. Let me welcome Cherry Shipo, professor in AADS, who will be introducing our guest speaker. Cherry, please.
Good evening. Tonight, Dr. Tom McClendon is in his lecture entitled Making African History in the U.S., the South African Education Program in the 1980s, will take us back to a moment where there is no need for abstract pontifications about the place of Africa in American institutions. He will take us to a moment historically when Black South African students fought apartheid on American ground. They used their education and experiences to question draconian mechanisms of oppression in South Africa, and sometimes their supportive structures in the West. As we chart new intellectual, political, and social territories that rigorously examine transnational Black freedom struggles, it is my hope tonight that this talk will help us reframe some of our ideas. We are privileged tonight to have Dr. Tom McClendon bring this historical narrative to life in all its complexities. This year's Distinguished Africa Lecturer is currently a professor of history in Southwestern University, where he has taught since 1998. He earned his PhD in African history at Stanford University, and he also has a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. As the author of numerous books and publications, most notably Genders and Generations Apart, Labor Tenants and Customary Law in Segregation-Era South Africa, and also White Chiefs, Black Lord, Shepstone and the Colonial State of Natal, he is certainly an authority in the field of Southern African history. His historical and legal expertise are sure to offer us a much clearer picture of the ways Black South African students made use of this education program, while also providing a context of American policies toward the country. Without taking any more time, I'd like to welcome him to the stage tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Took me a minute to get set up here. All this electronic gear. Ta-da. All right. Feel like a robot. Can everyone hear all right? But of course, if you can't hear, you didn't hear that either. All right. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I want to express my appreciation to Toyin and Falola truly the distinguished Africanist here, for organizing this event every year. My talk this evening grows out of research I'm doing with Pamela Scully of Emory University, whose thinking has helped shape my own. One of our principal sources is interviews I conducted with South Africans who participated in the program that I'm going to describe, and with Americans who were involved with the program or with the anti-apartheid movement on US campuses. And I'm grateful for the time these people took to talk to me. I will talk first about the context in which the program was created and grew, then about the experiences of some of those who came on the program, and I'll conclude with some thoughts about what I think is the importance of the program. I look forward to an opportunity to try to answer some questions after the talk. The South African Education Program, created by anti-apartheid activists in South Africa and the United States, brought over 1,500 Black South African students to study in the US between 1979 and 1995. SAEP coincided with intensified struggle against apartheid in South Africa and with the American movement, especially on university campuses, for divestment and sanctions. The program, SAEP, was in some ways congruent with the aims of President Reagan's constructive engagement policy, and the program was in fact largely funded, though not directed, by USAID. Many participants, as well as other South Africans in the US, however, played important roles in the anti-apartheid movement here. As the founders of the program hoped, some alumni of the program are prominent in the ongoing transformation of South Africa. There were important connections between political struggles in the United States and South Africa in the late 20th century, as you've just heard. President Obama, on his recent visit to South Africa, noted that he had been inspired to get involved in politics as a college student when he learned about apartheid. Like thousands of other American students, he worked in the early 1980s to get his college to divest from companies doing business in South Africa, making his first political speech in this cause. 15 years before that time, in 1966, Senator Robert F. Kennedy traveled to South Africa to give encouragement to those struggling against apartheid. His trip came only 2 years after Nelson Mandela and other leaders of the African National Congress were sentenced to life terms on Robben Island. At the University of Cape Town, Senator Kennedy noted the ongoing struggle for racial justice in the US and lauded South African youth for their parallel efforts, arguing that their work would lead to what he called ripples of hope, and that would, quote, build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance, alluding to the rhetoric, that's close quote after resistance, alluding to the rhetoric of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But the situation faced by Kennedy's audience was bleak. By the 1960s, the apartheid state had closed all avenues of legal resistance. The liberation movements, including the ANC, had been declared illegal. Mandela and others had embarked on armed resistance to convince white leaders to negotiate, but were met with even fiercer repression. By 1963, all prominent Black leaders were either in prison or in exile. In response, the international community began to issue statements of condemnation and to impose limited sanctions. But the West, in this time, including the United States, remained economically cozy with South Africa, which was a source of strategic minerals and a haven for profitable investment. South Africa enjoyed considerable immunity from American criticism in the context of the Cold War, portraying itself as a staunch foe of communism and arguing that Mandela and others seeking democratic rights were not only terrorists, as they said, but communists. Some of them were communists. And some people say Mandela was, but if so, very briefly. For a decade after the imprisonment of Mandela and the other leaders, the apartheid state seemed to be triumphant. It proceeded with plans to roll back the tide of black urbanization, dumping blacks in impoverished homelands, and stripping them of their citizenship by imposing phony independence on those areas, known derisively as Bantustans. But in the 1970s, open resistance reemerged. Okay. Steve Biko and other black university students created the movement known as Black Consciousness, drawing on ideas from the American Black Power movement and from the Africanism that had infused the ANC Youth League in the post-war era. Biko and his comrades argued that change must begin with psychological liberation. With blacks, and this is an important point, blacks now crucially taken to be all who were oppressed by apartheid, including coloreds and Asians as well as Africans, asserting their own self-worth and the value of their histories and cultures. Black consciousness was foundational for the emotional and intellectual rejection of apartheid for many of the students who later came to the US on the South African education program, mostly in the 1980s. In 1976, high school students in Soweto, the country's largest black township, emboldened by black consciousness ideals and by the recent liberation of Mozambique and Angola, protested against a new policy requiring important subjects to be taught in the high school in Afrikaans, which they called the language of the oppressor. As has happened at many crucial junctures in South African history, including last year's tragic massacre at the Marikana platinum mine, the police in 1976 Soweto reacted with extreme violence, turning a significant but local protest into a nationwide uprising that lasted for several months. During the upheavals, thousands of young people left the country and found their way to the armed wings of the liberation movements. The following year, 1977, the state detained the leaders of the Black Consciousness movement, and police killed Steve Biko in his cell, leading to further outrage both in South Africa and abroad. The momentum for change in South Africa, as well as the violence of the state's response, accelerated with successive waves of student and union activism from the late 1970s through the early 1990s. Though there were some significant reforms after Soweto, including legalization of black trade unions, other steps were cosmetic changes designed to deflect international criticism and divide the black population. In 1983, the apartheid government introduced a new constitution that purported to reform apartheid, but in fact entrenched it in a new form, crucially continuing to deny citizenship rights to the African majority and creating segregated and inferior representation for other black groups. The constitutional proposal prompted the formation of the United Democratic Front, and this is one of their posters, as a mass non-racial federation of organizations committed to dismantling apartheid. A year later, 1984, black township residents, angered by increased rents, engaged in protests that quickly mushroomed into a nationwide uprising that was more pervasive and long-lasting than anything that had come before. The ANC's leaders in exile seized this opportunity to call on their supporters to make the country ungovernable. In response, the government declared a state of emergency, put the townships under military occupation, and detained tens of thousands, especially young people. The ANC and COSATU, the trade union federation, urged the international community to impose wide-ranging sanctions now against South Africa, building on the milder sanctions and cultural boycotts the anti-apartheid movement had secured in various countries around the world and in the UN from the 1960s onward. From the time of the Soweto uprising and the murder of Biko in the late 1970s, South African events gave new strength to the international anti-apartheid movement's call in alliance with South African liberation movements for divestment and sanctions. That is, divestment from companies doing business in South Africa and sanctions to limit or prohibit trade with South Africa. In the US, this effort occurred especially on university campuses. After the township uprising began in 1984, the divestment movement became the biggest and most sustained student political movement since the struggle against the war in Vietnam. Beyond the campuses, activist groups like the American Committee on Africa and Randall Robinson's Trans-Africa Forum pressed the case for sanctions against South Africa and helped to coordinate protests around the country. Robinson and others initiated a continuous protest at the South African Embassy in Washington, inspiring similar actions around the country. While American students and other activists were pressing their case for divestment, however, US policy was moving in the opposite direction. The 1980 election of Republican Ronald Reagan steered American foreign policy in Southern Africa away from a stated emphasis on human rights under Jimmy Carter to a policy known as constructive engagement. Under this policy, conceived by the State Department's Chester Crocker, the US prioritized support for the South African government as a Cold War ally while minimizing criticism of apartheid policies. There was mild criticism, but very mild. Constructive engagement meant, among other things, that the US encouraged continued investment, continued trade, and continued cultural exchanges with South Africa, arguing that continued contact with Americans would help encourage a policy of gradual reform. Notably, and remember there had been some reform, but the 1983 Constitution made it clear that it was going to be extremely limited and wrong-headed. Notably, though, the Reagan administration, welcomed the constitutional change in 1983 that led to the formation of the UDF and set off the township uprising, arguing that the new constitution was part of a process of meaningful reform in South Africa after after Soweto. In opposition to the policy of constructive engagement, activists worked not only for policies that would isolate the apartheid state, but also for programs to help Black South Africans facing lack of opportunity, especially in the realm of education. Now we get to the point here. It was in this context that South Africans and Americans came together to create the South African Education Program. In 1979, Bishop, later Archbishop Desmond Tutu, founded the Educational Opportunities Council to address the educational crisis revealed by the Soweto uprising. Though apartheid policies intentionally stunted all levels of Black education, the EOC focused on tertiary education, where opportunities for Black students were severely constrained. One aspect of this was that Black students were normally bound to attend an institution designated for the ethnic group of their apartheid classification. Under apartheid, for instance, an Indian from the Cape had to go to Durban to attend the Indian University. Some Black students were able to attend so-called white universities, but only if they were able to get a permit from the Minister of Education. And once at that university, the Black student was unable to live in the residence halls or to use recreational facilities. Many white students and professors were far less than welcoming, according to some students who experienced this. Even attending the proper institution in apartheid terms was difficult for students who lacked the financial resources to be in school full-time. In many cases, these students had to spend long hours commuting from crowded township homes and in most cases, those homes lacked electricity. New funds and new venues for study would open a world of opportunity, Tutu argued, for the young black men and women who would emerge as leaders of a hoped-for post-apartheid South Africa. So this was really thinking ahead, although it turned out to be 15 years until the official end of apartheid. Many people thought it would be much longer. In 1979, many people thought it would be much longer. Tutu's EOC joined, that's the Educational Opportunities Council, joined with the New York-based Institute for International Education, IIE, to create the South African Education Program in 1979. The program was administered by IIE, with most of the funding eventually coming from USAID after 1983, the rest from universities and from private donors. SAEP provided for students transportation and stipends, sponsored an orientation program, which you're going to hear more about, and arranged with participating universities to provide tuition waivers. These facts highlight some of the contradictory political currents surrounding the US relationship with South Africa in the 1980s. While the policy of constructive engagement was essentially one of support for the apartheid government, pressures to show positive results under this policy and a projection that some form of democratic rule would eventually come to South Africa led an arm of the US government, like USAID, to support a program for the education of black South Africans in the United States. So in a way, SAP was perfectly congruent with the assumptions of constructive engagement, in that it promoted contact between South Africans and Americans with the hope of future improvement in South Africa. But the program, which operated entirely independently of the South African government and had no direct oversight by the US government, selected many activists to come on the program. The program's administrators in the US, like David Smock, saw themselves as anti-apartheid activists, and of course Tutu himself was a very prominent anti-apartheid activist. At a minimum, these organizers sought out participants who had leadership qualities and would be likely to make positive contributions to South African society in the future. Like the American government, American universities also faced contradictory pressures in relation to South Africa. At large public universities, Ivy League institutions, and at many liberal arts colleges, administrators faced well-organized student movements calling for divestment of university endowments from companies doing business in South Africa. By the mid-1980s, students in this movement were engaging in tactics of mass mobilization that had characterized the anti-war movement. In the 1980s, students in this movement were, in the mid-1980s, the surging student movement built mock shanties on many university campuses to physically represent the effects of apartheid. At Columbia, students occupied the administration building and engaged in a hunger strike. At Berkeley and MIT, demonstrations in support of divestment were met with considerable police violence, in a pale echo of the confrontations in South Africa. The movement eventually met with considerable success, with over 150 institutions adopting at least selective divestment. Whatever their response to divestment, though, universities were under pressure to demonstrate support for black South Africans in the context of apartheid and an intensifying struggle both here and there. And one way to do that, to demonstrate support for black South African students, was to participate in SAEP and similar programs. The main story of SAEP is one of providing educational opportunity to black South African students, and those former students in turn becoming important leaders in the post-apartheid transformation of South Africa. So to a large degree, the program worked very much as its founders envisioned. But we are also interested in how South Africans in the US interacted with the American arm of the global anti-apartheid movement. While observers are unable to ignore the prominent role played by South Africans in the British anti-apartheid organization, standard narratives of anti-apartheid efforts in the United States have taken less notice of the part played by South Africans here. Much of the nationwide divestment struggle, as it happens, was coordinated through the efforts of the American Committee on Africa, a New York NGO founded in the 1950s to support African liberation struggles. Jennifer Davis, a white South African, led that organization from 1981. Davis worked closely with Dumisani Khumalo, later the South African ambassador to the United States after the end of apartheid, and Khumalo actively toured American campuses in the 1980s, drumming up support. The American Committee on Africa conducted research about the role of US investment in supporting apartheid and helped coordinate the activities of those working around the country for divestment. The work of all these activists was aided immeasurably, in turn, by the speaking tours of prominent South Africans like Tutu, like Alan Buzak, like Chris Hani, and others who came to the US to press for sanctions and divestment. On a more local level, the ANC's, just to give one example, the ANC's representative in Boston, Themba Vilakazi, worked with the Free South Africa movement there, which he helped to found, to coordinate anti-apartheid efforts in that city's many universities. He was assisted by people like Gillian Hart, a white South African who taught at several universities in the Boston area in the 1980s. She worked closely with student leaders who came on the SAEP program, including Saki Makka Zoma, whom you're going to hear about repeatedly, who had served 5 years on Robben Island and who came to Boston University to study journalism. All these activists spoke at churches, at schools, and at civic groups and helped to raise awareness of apartheid and the call for divestment and sanctions. The US anti-apartheid movement reached its peak in October 1986, when Congress, reacting to a surging tide of public concern about apartheid, growing out of the efforts of these organizers on campus and beyond campuses, overrode President Reagan's veto to pass the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act that imposed a wide range of sanctions against South Africa. The override was a moment that significantly shifted US policy toward Southern Africa, even though Reagan was still president and Crocker was still in the State Department. And that shift, the act and what it imposed, contributed materially to the collapse of apartheid just a few years later, along with multiple other causes. Students who came on the SAEP program in the 1980s therefore entered an American political milieu that had contradictory political currents with respect to South Africa. In that context, the orientation for students entering the program was a crucial moment. On the advice of SAEP students who came in the first couple of years, IIE established an orientation program for entering students in 1982. Each year, SAEP students came as a group to Denison University, a liberal arts college in a small town in central Ohio, and spent 4 weeks there from mid-July to mid-August. All the former SAEP students we spoke to remember the orientation as an important part of the program. And this also comes out in other evaluations of EOC and SAEP. This was in part social, though the social was inescapably political. The students got to know each other, coming from many different parts of South Africa and many different backgrounds. They got to know each other and form bonds that lasted through their time in the States and beyond. This required overcoming apartheid divisions that at first shaped who socialized with whom, with colored students hanging out with coloreds, Africans with Africans, and so forth. While this was partly a matter of shared languages and geographic backgrounds, the commitment of most of these students to the ideals of Black consciousness which emphasized the common blackness of all oppressed by apartheid, or to the ANC's non-racialism, made them want to cut through these apartheid divisions. Alumni of the program contend that after recognizing the problem, they worked to transcend it, and they feel that they were successful. The bonds they created helped the students forge a student representative council in true South African fashion, because South African school and university students always have a student representative council at their institution. And so the SAEP Student Representative Council, SRC, gave them a forum to discuss common elements and interact with the IIE. SAEP students cemented these ties and discussed a range of issues at an annual meeting sponsored by IIE. Keep wanting to say EIEIO or something like that. IIE. Because students were frequently invited to address church groups, civic groups, and corporations confronting the issue of divestment, the SRC also insisted that IIE sponsor South African leaders like Tutu and Buzak to address their annual conferences, so that students could remain informed about fast-changing developments in South Africa, displacing earlier speakers like Chester Crocker. The orientation program also provided an opportunity for representatives of the liberation movements. The orientation program also provided an opportunity for representatives of the liberation movements to meet with students as a group. This occurred each year on August 9th, South African Women's Day, commemorating the 1956 Women's Anti-Pass March. According to one of the participants I spoke to, Jonathan Janssen, and he'll be mentioned again also, this was, for many, the first time they had come face to face with leaders of these liberation movements. For some, according to him, this was exciting and liberating. For others, somewhat traumatic. For some, like Janssen himself, it helped point them towards combining their time in the States with continued or even deepened activism. On a more practical level, the orientation program provided refresher courses in math and statistics, helped students understand the more discussion-oriented style of American education, provided typing instruction and typewriters, you can see how long ago this was, or later computers by the late 80s, and generally helped prepare students for life on American campuses, helping them approach their programs with greater confidence. In fact, the building of intellectual confidence is the strongest and most consistent general theme about SAEP that emerges from interviews with former participants, as well as in surveys conducted in 2 formal evaluations of the program. And this theme resonates with many students' early embrace of Black consciousness, as they mentioned in their interviews. So let us turn to briefly consider a couple of particular cases of those who came on the program. And let's see a picture of a couple of them. Nazima Mohammed, this person, is now Director of Transformation at the University of the Witwatersrand, known as WITS. She came on SAEP in 1983 to get her undergraduate degree at Denison, the site of the orientation. Mohammed was born and raised in District 6, the dense racially mixed neighborhood of Cape Town, that, like Sophiatown in Johannesburg, apartheid officials declared a white group area and relocated nearly all its inhabitants. In the case of District 6, however, one small corner known as Zonneblum was considered an industrial area and remained standing, and that's where Mohammed grew up. Her grandfather, originally from India, was a prominent fruit merchant, and her father worked in that business. Her mother, from a family that were the Mohammed's tenants, was classified colored under apartheid and were of Indonesian slave heritage. Apartheid regulations would normally have placed her in an Indian school. But since there were not enough Indian schools in the area, Mohammed attended colored schools. So you start to see some of the arbitrariness of apartheid. The fact that her parents were classified differently under apartheid created difficulty when her parents separated briefly and she was living with her mother in Natal. There, a classic apartheid dilemma confronted her when she could not get into colored schools because her father was Indian and could not get into Indian schools because she was transferring from a colored school. When she finally was admitted, her arrival coincided with the beginning of a nationwide school boycott, and she was soon expelled for participating. In her memory, this was because other students asked her to explain what was happening in Cape Town, where the boycott had begun. They pushed her onto stage to speak her first political speech, and soon after, her mother got a call from the principal saying that the child was a troublemaker. The family returned to Cape Town, where she attended a high school whose administration was committed to high academic standards, including teaching subjects like math and science that were not deemed appropriate under apartheid for black students. She recalls the teachers being quite political, but that they tried to keep protest within the bounds of the school so that students did not engage in direct confrontation with police or jeopardize their education. So based on this academic foundation, Mohammed was able to get a permit to attend the so-called white University of Cape Town, and there she participated in protests, including some related to poor conditions for black students at the white university. In her second year, though, she learned about SAEP from a fellow student and applied on a lark, according to her, with little expectation that she would be accepted. In fact, she was accepted to do a BA at Denison, arriving there in 1984. So remember, that's the time just after the implementation of the new constitution and the time of the township uprising beginning. She remembers orientation with 140 South African students being primarily a process of overcoming apartheid categories of race and ethnicity and learning to connect across those divides. She also says that she initially felt guilty about leaving the struggle in South Africa just as it was reaching new heights with the spread of UDF and the beginning of the township uprising. But then representatives of the ANC came to speak at orientation, including the impressive, her word impressive, Saki Makka Zoma, the student who was organizing in Boston. Makka Zoma, who is now a very prominent business leader in South Africa, is also chair of the governing body of Wits University, where Mohammed is an administrator. Inspired by him at orientation in 1984, she established the South African Awareness Group at Denison, a vibrant organization advocating divestment and which had eventual success. Mohammed did research to be able to answer questions about the struggle in South Africa and made presentations both on campus and to various community forums. The organization, like its parallel organizations on dozens of campuses in this period, built shanties to raise awareness of living conditions under apartheid and had to frequently re-erect them after conservative students knocked them down. Mohammed remembers Denison in the 1980s as being like family ties, where the professors were the hippie parents and most of the students were the young Reaganites. Like many other interviewees and others surveyed in large-scale evaluations of SAEP, Mohammed emphasizes the psychological liberation that she experienced in American classrooms. As she put it, there was a sense of being in the States that was extremely liberating. I appreciated that freedom. And the States is racist as well. But there was a sense, even being in the classroom, where you felt more respected. And I don't know if it was in my head or my friends' heads, because we all felt like that, or if it was our own mental slavery in a sense. You sit in a South African classroom and you feel like you are not respected. And then you leave and you're in another classroom and you feel that you matter. That's the end of the quote. This, for everyone I spoke to, and a similar refrain appears in other surveys, was the enduring result of SAEP, gaining increased intellectual confidence. As Black consciousness called on them to do, these students liberated themselves psychologically, but they were aided in doing so by being outside the apartheid context. And that intellectual confidence and psychological liberation has paid enormous dividends in terms of the transformational roles of many alumni of the program, that many alumni of the program have undertaken in post-apartheid South Africa. Okay, I don't want to leave the impression, however, that all SAEP students were anti-apartheid activists, either in South Africa or in the US. Nor do I want to claim that the careers of SAEP alumni have been uniformly in the public interest, or that one must have been an activist to go on to do positive work. To give an example of the latter, a counterexample on the latter point, Thandi Poane, for instance, a professor of public health at the University of the Western Cape, grew up in rural Zululand, became a nurse, and was never involved in political struggle. But SAEP gave her the opportunity to get a master's and PhD in public health at UC Berkeley, and she now does research on nutrition and disease among poor women in Cape Town's margins. It is unlikely that this career trajectory would have been as readily available to her without the opportunity provided by SAEP at that time. But for some former participants, activist engagement was a central part of the program. Perhaps SAEP's most impressive alumnus, Jonathan Jansen, whom I mentioned earlier, who's now Vice Chancellor, equivalent to President of the University of the Free State, and is a prominent social and political critic in South Africa, says that he became more politically engaged and active while on the program. I remember him as a powerful advocate for South African liberation and as a sharp debater at Stanford, where we overlapped in grad school in the late 1980s. In fact, my memory of his compelling presence and involvement in these struggles was the main inspiration for beginning to do this research. Jansen, in the 1980s and early 90s, also spoke about South Africa and engaged in other Africa-related activism around the Bay Area while completing his PhD in international development education. He has remained both politically engaged and a thorn in the side of the powerful in post-apartheid times. The acknowledgement to a recent collection of his op-ed pieces concludes, quote, "And to my distant friends in power, thank you for lousy governance. You give me something to write about." All right. Probably the other most prominent former participant, along with Jansen, is Saki Makka Zoma, and his case suggests some of the ambiguities of post-apartheid South Africa. Makka Zoma is chair of Liberty Holdings, a big financial group, and several other financial and mining firms. As one of the most prominent beneficiaries of BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, he shows up on lists of the wealthiest South Africans. Observers peg his wealth in the hundreds of millions of rand. He grew up in Port Elizabeth, the son of working-class parents. In 1976, the year of Soweto, as part of a high school Black consciousness organization, he helped plan a protest march. The march never happened. Before the march could happen, police arrested the organizers and charged them with contravening Section 6 of the Terrorism Act. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years on Robben Island. After his release, he worked with Tutu at the South African Council of Churches and learned from him about SAEP. In addition, the Port Elizabeth representative of SAEP was a fellow ex-Robben Islander who had been one of Makka Zoma's high school teachers. Though he was interested in the opportunity, Makka Zoma was concerned about abandoning the struggle by going to the US, similar to Mohammed. And Makka Zoma was apparently worried about going into the belly of the capitalist beast. But Mandela, whom he knew from Robben Island, advised him in correspondence from prison that the young man had already contributed to the struggle and that it was time to invest in education. Mandela also said, according to Makka Zoma, if you want to educate a capitalist, send him to Russia. If you want to educate a socialist, send him to America. Because both systems will tell you that the perfect system doesn't exist. Now, I don't know if Mandela actually said that, but that's what Makka Zoma says he said. In this case, if he did say it, Mandela may have underestimated the attractions of capitalism, or at least failed to predict the direction South Africa would take after apartheid. Makka Zoma, so going back to his time in SAEP, he studied for an MA in journalism at BU, whereas I have noted he was quite active in the divestment movement and in SAEP students' SRC. He returned to South Africa at the height of the state of emergency and went back to work at the South African Council of Churches. After the unbanning of the ANC, he became an ANC spokesman and was elected to its National Executive Committee, holding that position until 2008. After a short stint as head of the parastatal firm Transnet in 1998, he joined Standard Bank, one of South Africa's largest financial firms, and Standard Bank remains at the center of his many holdings. Of course, Makka Zoma's material success may be due more to his natural abilities and his former political connections, he left the ANC in 2008, than his experiences with SAEP. When asked about how the program benefited him, though, he noted that it kept him out of jail. This, of course, is not insignificant. Iron Rensburg, who came to study in the US later on a different program and is now Vice Chancellor of Johannesburg University, spent 3 years in detention in the mid-1980s, several months of it in solitary confinement. And a similar fate may well have befallen Makka Zoma if he had not been in the US. Makka Zoma also argued, more generally, that SAEP gave him valuable experience in living in a foreign society and learning to explain the problem of apartheid and the need for sanctions to audiences of, quote, really conservative people. And he was in Boston, by the way. He found this experience valuable when participating in negotiations for the democratic transition in South Africa in the early 90s. Going beyond himself, he argues that while only a minority of SAEP participants may have been actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the US, all would have been involved in explaining South Africa and apartheid, thereby influencing popular opinion. To conclude, the South African education program was an important intervention by concerned citizens in South Africa and in the US to provide opportunities for tertiary education that were sorely lacking for Black South Africans. From one political angle, the program can be seen as a sop to critics of apartheid, which did little to further the immediate anti-apartheid struggle. From a different point of view, however, SAEP can also be viewed as a crucial building block of post-apartheid South Africa in helping to nurture leaders through giving them international experience, good education denied them in South Africa, and intellectual and social confidence, also difficult to sustain under apartheid. To a degree, the program, as I've said, was congruent with constructive engagement in that it engaged South Africa in a manner that did not immediately threaten the apartheid regime. In the context of the 1980s, when many school children abandoned apartheid education to protest state terror in the streets, the beneficiaries of SAEP benefited from a privilege offered to very few. A handful of students left the country and gained an excellent education, while their peers died in the streets and in prison, or at the very least, lost years of education. In a sense, SAEP exemplifies the contradictions and tensions of revolutions everywhere. The foot soldiers of revolution rarely benefit from the sacrifices they made in stopping their education. The future, in this case, belongs to those who are educated. Yet, if in essence the SAEP could be seen as training the elite of a future South Africa, It also created the context, perhaps primarily through the 4-week summer orientation, for radicalizing some members of that elite in a way that might be said to have benefited South Africa in the long term. Especially in the program's first few years, SAEP helped counterbalance US policy under Reagan that prioritized Cold War interests over human rights and tilted toward the apartheid government. Some SAEP students, including some of those who are most prominent in leading the ongoing transformation of South African society, used the opportunity provided by the program to engage with the anti-apartheid movement in the US, playing crucial roles as witnesses to apartheid and as advocates for sanctions and divestment. Thank you.